Okay, perfect. I'm going to kick off. So good morning all. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and welcome to Born Social Presents Going Global on Social. My name is Steph and I'm a Senior Social Media Manager at Born and I'll be your host this morning. So for anyone who hasn't been to any of our Born Social Present series before, we've hosted a range of events throughout this year to answer the questions that both agencies and brands alike have been asking themselves the past few months. From how to get the most out of your production in isolation, to how e-commerce has been impacted by the pandemic, our approach to influencer work, and motion design. All of these are still available on our website if anyone is interested to watch those. So we're here today to specifically talk about how and why to scale your business to serve customers in markets outside of your own. Global e-commerce is massively on the rise and doesn't show any sign of slowing. Having successfully helped multiple businesses do this over the years on social, we wanted to share our key learnings so that if you are considering doing this for yours, hopefully you'll go away with the tools that you need to begin that process. Joining me today will be James, our Senior Paid Media Manager, and John, our Paid Media Manager, who will be able to share with you what to do, but also what not to do, and sharing some key learnings from their own experiences. James will start by giving you a breakdown of the state of play, looking at how and why global e-commerce is growing so quickly and why it's an important consideration for your business. And John will then take you through his top tips to get you started, and we'll also share some brand examples along the way. But ahead of diving into the content, I'm just going to quickly run through some house rules. This session will be recorded and the slides will be sent to you following the session if you do wish to rewatch or hopefully share with anyone else who you may find it interesting. You'll also see a Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Please do make use of this throughout the session. Hopefully we'll have some time to go through them at the end. And if your question doesn't get answered or you have any other thoughts following it, please do let us know at shout@bornsocial.co.uk and we'll get back to you. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to James, who's going to share with you why going global on social is so important.
Great, thanks, Steph. Hi, guys. I'm James here. Yeah, as Steph said, I'm Senior Paid Media Manager at Born. I want to take you through a little bit about why we think going global is so important, but also kind of the opportunity that we see there, and just a little bit around kind of some stuff that you can be doing or thinking about if it's a question that you've been asking yourself over the last couple of months. But first, let's start with the state of play and why we're all here. So global e-commerce sales are rising and predicted to rise even further. I don't think that is a surprise to any of you. Global e-commerce sales in 2019 were forecast at around $3.5 trillion. But incredibly, that is set to rise massively over the next 3 years to $6.5 trillion in just 3 years' time. So that's like huge, huge growth in a really short space of time, which creates an incredible opportunity for lots of different businesses who sell online, but also businesses who want to kind of change their model to enable them to service their customers better online. And when we think about that growth and how it's happened, I think the D2C model springs to mind first. Those companies have had really, really great success cutting out the middleman and selling their products directly to consumers, using online advertising to introduce their products and attract further customers. Examples being companies like Allbirds, Away, Glossier, Peloton. I could go on. I'm sure those will be quite familiar to you all. But interestingly, traditional retailers have kind of seen a little bit of that success. And they're trying to kind of muscle in at the minute and take a bit of that momentum for themselves. I thought this was a really interesting example of Pantry Shop, which is owned by PepsiCo. It's a very basic e-commerce website that they're running in the US. It has 6 buttons essentially for the different kind of packages of goods that you can see here: everyday pantry, hydration, workout and recovery, and you simply click through like you would on any e-commerce website, add the products that you want to your basket, and they'll deliver them to your home. I think it's a bit of a clunky first attempt, but you can be sure that a company the size of PepsiCo will be back and will be iterating on this stuff, and I think it really does prove that where there were once small players in this area, there were bigger and bigger players coming into the space too. On top of this, I think globalization has led to some emerging markets with increased spending power. Interestingly, by the end of 2020, there'll be 1.4 billion people in the world's middle class, and 85% of those will be in the Asia Pacific region. You can see here that retail e-commerce sales growth in 2019 grew 25% in Asia Pacific, followed very closely by Latin America, the Middle East and Africa, and then Central and Eastern Europe coming in fourth, 19.4%. That e-commerce is starting to move away from kind of the global West into these new regions with increased spending power and a thirst for goods and new services as their kind of wealth increases. Luckily for us, there are a couple of platforms that help us level the global e-commerce playing field, I guess, and service those customers wherever they might be in the world. This is an example of how Shopify, a huge e-commerce platform, has grown over the last few years. They're now in 175 countries across the world and counting, with 377,000 merchants on their platform alone. I think that's huge. It just shows how many different types of businesses are able to target across the world. But it also presents a really great opportunity to kind of level the playing field, where previously you might have had to have infrastructure which creates a high barrier to entry for kind of new and smaller players. Platforms like Facebook allowing you to advertise in every country across the world, added with companies like Shopify allowing you to sell to those customers wherever they might be, creates a massive global opportunity for brands and businesses. And on top of that, we have other companies like third-party logistics businesses, which make it easier and easier to ship those products internationally after you've sold them, taking away some of the, again, barriers to entry for smaller businesses and allowing the playing field to be democratized and accessible to all parties. These companies usually handle things like warehousing, inventory, shipping, and delivery, taking those stresses away from business owners and founders and allowing you to outsource those to companies who have built up those infrastructure routes in the markets that you're looking to serve. And predictably, that industry is set to get bigger and bigger as well. So you can see here that the US third-party logistics market is increasing year on year from $172 billion in 2017, and that's going up in all categories over the next 10 years. So a massive opportunity there to kind of outsource the shipping costs and logistics costs to other companies who have stronger bases in the country that we're looking to target. If you came to the last Born Social event that we ran on e-commerce, we spoke a lot about three changes to the kind of market that I think have been instrumental in the last few months, at least, in kind of accelerating some of the changes that I just took you through. The first being the Great Pivot, that being a kind of change in businesses having to adapt how they sell to their customers. That was kind of forced upon them by the lockdown that we all went through from March to kind of July, August time. But people weren't going out, shops are all closed, and people really had to change the way that they were getting their products and goods to the customers who wanted to buy them. Another impact of that lockdown and pandemic period was that consumers' behaviours changed as well, and we had these emerging behaviours of people buying in different ways to what they were used to, and also, importantly, buying different products to what they were used to. I think food is a great example of how people weren't necessarily buying on places like Amazon, or you saw that PepsiCo example, which would be much more, people will be much more comfortable doing that now as a result of how we were all kind of forced to live through the pandemic. And I don't think that behaviour is set to change. underpinning all of that, you have social commerce. So the technology that allows us to buy differently and facilitated the first two changes that we saw in the pandemic. Facebook are pouring money into developing online checkout platforms, in-app checkout platforms, and kind of contactless payment systems, which make transferring money across the world more and more simple as time goes on. So those are kind of three things that can push this area forward. And I think you can see the evidence of what's happened when you look at the share of total global retail sales from 2015 to 2023. This is pre-pandemic forecast, so you can see that that number was set to land at 14.1% and rise by roughly 2% every year till hitting 22% in 2023, which alone would be a really significant opportunity and a great chance to grow businesses. When you look at the impact the pandemic has had, it's essentially just supercharged all of that growth. You can see on the left here that online sales as a percentage of total retail sales hit 30% in the UK over the course of the pandemic, up from a previous high of kind of just over 20s. There's a 50% increase on previous numbers. And although that was trending upwards, you can see how that's just rocketed due to the changes in behaviour that the pandemic brought upon us all. And I thought this was also interesting from the CTO of Shopify on the right, who said as they're kind of helping their businesses to move online, the platform is now seeing Black Friday levels of traffic every single day. So if you think about some of the traffic that you were seeing on your from your performance marketing on Black Friday last year, I'm sure those numbers were pretty big. Shopify is now seeing that every single day as a result of the changes in behaviour due to the pandemic. So a massive opportunity here, huge growth in this area, and that's why we think it's really important that you're thinking about your kind of global e-commerce strategy. So moving on to why this and why now, I think based on everything I just took you through, it's quite tempting to want a bigger slice of the pie. Some of those numbers are pretty punchy, and I think they represent a really great opportunity. If you're anything like me, your eyes are lighting up at the opportunity to kind of expand clients and businesses into these new untapped regions. But what I really want to do before we get into kind of how is to kind of pull back a little bit and just talk about why you want to go global, because I think the answer to this question really, really helps when deciding where to go first and what to focus on. So I'm just going to take you guys through a few different scenarios. Some might be familiar to you, some might not, of why you might think about moving into a new market and how to kind of approach that question. So firstly, it may be that you've kind of maxed out your sales in your home market or your number one market. This curve here is a kind of typical D2C kind of growth curve that we see for brands who kind of have this really high growth, fast scaling, low CPA, phase one growth. I think a lot of the businesses who were kind of early to market in kind of 2015 type time went through massive growth because of low CPAs on Facebook, kind of hit a bit of a plateau where growth started to slow down. You had increased customer acquisition costs and you kind of started to think, I might need a bit of a new approach. If you're kind of in this area where you're starting to see things slow down a little bit and you're not necessarily sure about how to fix that, it might be a good idea to start looking at what markets you can expand into so you can kind of replicate the growth you had in years previous in another region. On top of that, I think your primary channel, which in many cases is Facebook because of how ubiquitous that platform is when it comes to e-commerce, is starting or has already got more and more competitive. So it's harder to do well there. In the initial kind of discover phase, as I said a few years ago, there was less competition on the platform. People were competing for or competing with less other brands, all trying to take audience's attention. So channel efficiency was super high, competition was super low. As the kind of secret of the D2C model gets out, you go through this exploit phase where more and more advertisers flood the platform. Competition starts to rise until you get to a kind of steady state where Facebook is kind of sitting now, where there's an incredible number, hundreds of thousands of different advertisers on the platform. But because of that, efficiency is lower. It's just harder to generate the same CPAs as you were getting in years gone by as it might be to do now. If that seems familiar to you, that's a really great reason to start looking at markets where there is potentially less competition to get a kind of steal on your competitors potentially there. On top of that, it might be that your hero products fit best at a certain time of year. I had a look at waterproof jackets as an example of a product which is quite specific to a certain season or weather condition. And I thought the results were interesting. So if you look at Australia and the USA, in Australia, searches for waterproofs are well above the level in the USA for basically most of the year until you get to September time, where they flip over and demand goes up in the US and down in Australia. Now, one of the real great perks of being able to advertise globally is that you can kind of set up a sales funnel which chases the sun almost, and only markets when the conditions are right and demand is likely to be up. It's so easy to move your spend around that it's possible to scale up in areas where demand is about to increase and scale down in areas where they don't need your product to ensure that sales are still strong and profitable all year round. On top of that, I think you need to think about whether your business model works for going abroad. So if you have the total sale price that you can get from an item and you add on your kind of cost of goods and your ad costs, so your CPA, if you're shipping things domestically in the UK, if that's your home market, you have a certain cost there, which is likely to be lower than internationally, and then you've got your profit on top of that. Obviously, slightly simplified, but hopefully you get the idea. Going abroad, you might have the same cost of goods and the same ad costs, but your 3PL costs are likely to be higher than if you're just shipping in your home country. That means your profit is lower. Now, that might be okay if you're selling products with a super high margin and you're able to kind of absorb some of that cost and still maintain efficiency. But really, really look at your business model, and if it is the kind of model where you rely on lower margins but high volume to scale and take profit, I think you need to think very carefully about where you want to move because of the different costs associated with different regions. On top of this, I guess not even on top of, but following on from this, your product might be borderless, which represents a great opportunity. We're sitting on one right now, an online course or webinar, and I think in late March, early April, people were jumping onto all of these courses that people were setting up, selling online. Those have kind of started to drop off a little bit. But they're still way, way higher than we were pre-COVID. And the great thing about borderless products like courses and webinars, etc., is that they don't require any shipping costs at all. So it makes complete sense to start selling those in different regions because the fact that they're on digital platforms makes it so, so simple to expand the reach of them. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about, when you're thinking about why you want to go global or where to go global, you need to think about areas in which you already have high brand awareness if you're already advertising. We know that the impact of long-term brand building work and sales activation together is greater than either of them can have alone when it comes to incremental sales. And so it makes complete sense to go into a region where you already have a strong advertising spend and high brand salience and brand awareness. Your performance marketing activity is going to do so much better here than it will do if you go somewhere where you're a complete unknown, really. So think about the areas in which your brand marketing is doing well in and use those to guide you when it comes to choosing a country. The answer to all of those questions will help you decide where you want to go first. And to talk a little bit more about that, I'm going to hand over to John to take you through some examples and some case studies.
Thanks, James. So just before we get going, I just wanted to quickly introduce myself for anybody who missed the start of the presentation. My name is John. I'm a paid media manager at Born Social, and I specialize in performance marketing, so overseeing a lot of our e-commerce clients. And a really big focus for us over the last couple of years has been scaling up our international efforts for those clients who are selling products online. So whilst this was something relatively new to us a few years ago, we've come a long way since then and gained a load of really valuable insights along the way. So for the remainder of this presentation, we're going to take you through some of those things that we've learned and hopefully cover some areas that you'll find valuable if you're considering going global. And if you already are advertising internationally, then hopefully there'll still be some key takeaways that you can apply to your current activity. So in terms of what are we going to cover today? Firstly, going to dive into a little bit why a one-size policy doesn't work across all regions. We're then going to run through a bit of a checklist for choosing your countries and look at some of the things you may not have thought of when choosing your next market. Then James is going to run us through picking your moment. When is the right time to expand? And finally, going to run through a bit of a case study on the USA in relation to one of our clients and this idea of thinking big but acting locally. So the first thing we want to make really clear is this idea that a one-size policy does not apply to all markets. You can't simply take your current market approach and assume that that's going to work in other markets with minimal input. These platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Pinterest make it incredibly easy to run ads in these countries, but simply flicking the switch and including them in your targeting isn't going to get you the best results. So on the next list, we have this, on the next slide, we have this slightly daunting list of some of the factors that you need to consider when moving into a new market. So product demand, weather, political climate, holidays and events, cost of advertising, languages, payment methods, current cultures, competitors. The list really does go on, but all of these things have the potential to make or break your ad performance. And understanding the state of play and diving into these things is crucial if you want to maximize your ad spend efficiency. So the following section is going to be a bit of a checklist of how to approach these things. So just before we get going, bit of a word of warning. It's unlikely that you're going to see the same results in these new markets from day one. You're often going to be moving into these new markets with very few customers, close to zero data, and really not having an understanding of all those intricacies that make up a market that you will have learned by advertising in your home market. So you might be lucky and see great success from day one, but you should at least be prepared for weeks, if not months, of subpar performance whilst you sort of build up these learnings and get to a point where you're able to demonstrate a return on ad spend that's great for the business. But without wanting to scare you too much, we're going to dive into a bit about choosing your country. And by choosing your country, we don't just mean including those countries in your targeting on Facebook. Depending on the type of business or the type of product you're selling, there's going to be a big list of pros and cons for each, and you need to weigh up each of these before going global. So assuming you have your logistics sorted and you're able to ship worldwide, the next few slides should act as a bit of a checklist for things that you need to consider. So the first point that may sound quite obvious, but it's a really good place to start, is sufficient demand. So making sure that the areas you're planning on expanding into have big enough audiences and that there's going to be sufficient demand for your products. So if you've already achieved sort of significant scale in the UK, then chances are you're spending a fair bit of money on your ads, and you need to be moving somewhere that's going to have the audience sizes to be able to make a noticeable dent in your incremental sales. We don't want to be investing all this time, spending loads of time researching these different places, if you're going to go over there and saturate your target audience within a few weeks or months even. You want somewhere that you can advertise for an extended period of time, build your brand, and really deliver like a volume of sales in that market. Otherwise, it's probably just not worth your time. Facebook's algorithm is incredibly clever these days at finding the right people to purchase your products, but it does work best with big data. We need to be giving it audiences in the tens, or if not hundreds or millions of thousands in order for it to do its job. But this idea of total demand is only one part of the picture. And what's more important is product market fit. So on the next slide, we've got a few examples of different countries, and the numbers below each of these flags represent the audience sizes of people who have expressed an interest in swimming on Facebook or Instagram. So whilst these top flags represent the UK, United States, and Japan, are some of the world's biggest purchasing powers and the sort of biggest bubbles on that graph on the slide before, they may not necessarily be the best places for your product. So whilst they're the most obvious, once you actually sort of dive in and look at how the different countries are interested in your products, there may be some better options. So taking the examples of Japan and Portugal on our right, Japan is the third biggest economy in the world. Portugal comes in at number 47. Japan has a population over 10 times the size of Portugal. Yet when we're looking at this swimming niche, we can see that the interests, like the amount of people interested in that, are pretty similar. So one thing we'd recommend doing before choosing which region to go into is to get into Ads Manager and sort of make a list of all the potential countries and then search for key interests. So the sort of broad interests surrounding your products, but then also all the kind of associated ones, and essentially just making a list of how big those potential audiences are. And swimming is a pretty broad example, but if your product is quite niche, you might sort of find much more interesting results, especially once you kind of start stacking interests and looking how they relate to each other. But demand is just one thing to consider. On the next slide, we also look at the cost of advertising and essentially how much it's going to cost for you to run your ads in different countries. So this chart here from AdCostly analyzed about 150,000 different campaigns across $5 million of ad spend. And what you can see here is that the United States has the highest CPM, and a CPM is the cost of displaying 1,000 people your ads, or displaying your ads 1,000 times. So CPMs are essentially calculated by audience size in relation to how many people are advertising against that interest. So the more advertisers there are for a particular audience, generally the higher the costs it will be to advertise to that audience. It's just sort of the theories of basic supply and demand. So we know that whilst the US has huge purchasing power and a lot of demand, it's also the most expensive place to advertise because of the sheer amount of people advertising there. So thinking back to that previous slide, whilst there are a lot of people interested in swimming in the USA, we know that Portugal is likely to have much lower CPMs because there's far fewer people advertising in that space. It's also worth noting that CPMs can fluctuate massively depending on the time of the year and events that are happening in that country. So the United States, for example, at the moment is seeing huge CPMs because of the presidential election. Biden and Trump have spent almost $300 million in ads in the second half of Q3. which is a huge amount of money and is essentially pushing up the costs of advertising across the country. In some of the swing states like Florida, where they're advertising even more heavily, we're seeing CPMs roughly 10 times what they were during lockdown. So James is going to go into a little bit more detail about when is the best time to move into a country, but right now it's not a great time to be advertising in the US, and we're sort of scaling back spends, especially on Facebook, and looking at other platforms where there isn't quite the same level of political ad spend at the moment. And then the final crucial factor to consider when looking at expansion is the language spoken in that country. So this data here from the Common Sense Advisory shows that 75% of people want to buy in their own language, and that 59% of people will never buy from English-only websites, which is quite a staggering figure when you're thinking about e-commerce. You're leaving a lot of money on the table if you're not translating your websites and also your ads. So we see the same with a lot of the ads we're running, is that getting things translated is 100% worth it. And we do see quite increases in performance by doing so, but it does come at a cost. And it also does slow down the speed at which you can test things. Whereas in UK, which might be your home market, you're able to make new copy iterations very quickly. You can do it almost instantly. Same with ads, it's just a matter of sort of briefing in your creative department. Whereas if you have to go back and forth with the translator, it obviously slows the speed at which you can test things, which might then impact your results. So just another thing to consider. But James is now going to run you through picking your moments and when might be the best time to expand internationally.
Cheers, John. Yeah, so picking your moment, it's just as important as picking your country, really, because as we know, buying behaviour is different during different points in the year. And so if you're going to come into a new country that you haven't necessarily run before, or even if you are running in a country and you have been for a little bit of time, I think there is some really interesting insight to be gained from looking at specific moments in your kind of calendar that will lead you to success. We've spoken about this already, but there's lots and lots of stuff outside of the kind of Facebook ad performance that impacts the ability to perform well when you're moving into other markets. Massive elections, political spend there, the economy, the weather. You've got these kind of like holiday commerce moments. Those can probably be a little bit daunting, especially if you're, trying to balance what's going on in your home market with what's going on abroad. If you're in 2 or 3, staying on top of all of those things is crucial, but yeah, it's difficult to do. So I just wanted to kind of break down some of our thoughts on that and share them with you, because as we know, buying behaviours are different in each country. So for true success, you need to adapt your marketing calendar and kind of really have an ear to the ground on what's going on in the places that you're running in. And to do that, well, first actually, so we'll talk about the popular holiday moments that a lot of e-commerce discussion kind of centers around. The big one coming up is obviously Black Friday. They have familiar drawbacks. First being increased competition. Everybody wants to do well at Black Friday, right? It's like the first thing that anybody talks about when it comes to e-commerce at this time of year, before Christmas. And that means everybody's like, the strategies are all going at the same big moment. It's not to say you can't do well there, but there is increased competition. And that competition leads to rising CPMs. It makes it more expensive to advertise. And so you might not necessarily get what you were expecting if you go into a market where there are huge competitors and huge players spending way more money than you are, stealing those conversions away from you whilst you're just kind of like testing and starting to scale up. It's a bit of a David v Goliath battle. But if you look at some kind of alternative options, you can still take advantage of those key moments in lots of countries across the world, which don't necessarily have those big players fighting for people's attention there. So I wanted to take you through a couple of examples in a kind of alternative e-commerce calendar. You take Q1, you've got the obvious things like kind of Super Bowl Sunday, Chinese New Year, Mother's Day, which will attract significant ad spend. But in Japan and East Asia, there is actually quite an interesting opportunity with White Day, which is a month after Valentine's Day. Everybody who received a gift on Valentine's Day buys a gift back for the person who gifted them a month earlier, which is a lovely idea. The opportunity there is that where most people are focusing their spend around Valentine's Day and what you can do there, you've got the same buying behaviour a month later at an event that no one is really talking about, especially in the UK. That's a great opportunity for you to kind of go after that, knowing that people are in a mindset where they might like to buy, but without some of the kind of drawbacks of going after a kind of popular moment. And that continues through into the rest of next year. So instead of Labor Day in the US, you might look at Cinco de Mayo or Victoria Day in Canada. Again, all days celebrating kind of national history, but not as publicized and not as competitive as the kind of big American days like Labor and Memorial Day. In Q3, you might want to ignore 4th of July or not put as much focus in there, but actually pivot your strategy and look at things like Canada Day or Bastille Day in France. Again, celebrations where people are likely to be in a buying mindset without the drawbacks of increased competition and rising costs on the platforms. And then when we talk about Q4, we have Canadian Thanksgiving, which is on the 14th of October, 6 weeks earlier than the American Thanksgiving, where everybody is kind of aiming their strategies at, which again presents an opportunity. And you've also got Diwali, India being the biggest country in the world. There are loads of gifting that's going on around that moment, but I don't see that going on to as many marketing calendars as I think it could do, and those are opportunities for you to kind of get ahead of your competition and kind of stop fighting for the same piece of business and start to go after other bits of activity which might have a positive impact on your performance. It's good to launch around these times because demand is up, so you're likely to generate increased performance, as I said, without having to kind of battle rising costs as well. And the evidence is shown here. When you look at the CPMs of Canada and the USA over the last kind of 12, 13 months, significantly cheaper to go to Canada than it is in the USA. So whilst everyone, and we'll talk you through the USA later on, it's often the first place that people say that they want to kind of crack. It's an incredibly difficult place to break into and expensive as well, especially right now. You can see the impact of the election in the latter months, but even since the start of this year, really, CPMs in Canada have been half that of the USA. That means you're basically able to reach double the amount of people with the same cost. And if you can get your sales funnel working there in that market, there's a great opportunity for you there, which isn't necessarily the place that everybody else is looking to go to. But on that, I'm going to hand back over to John, who is going to take you through a case study on America. I think, despite everything I've just said, it's the number one place that people ask us about as a team, and that clients want to expand into for obvious reasons. So we thought it would be good to share some of the stuff that we've been doing there, if there's any takeaways that you can kind of bring from those.
Great, thanks, James. So yeah, we're going to be talking through a little bit of a case study on the US and looking at some of the strategies we've used for a client of ours called Dock and Bay. For those of you who don't know Dock and Bay, it started out as a sort of quick drying beach towel brand. They got 3 offers on Dragon's Den. They sort of achieved lots of success in the UK market. But a big focus for them over the last couple of years, as well as introducing new products, has been the US and essentially how do we achieve growth there. So I'm going to talk you through some of the strategies that we've used there, but it's worth noting these can be applied anywhere, these ideas. They don't have to just be to the US market. And we've taken the same principles and applied them to other accounts in the UK and Australia, and also seen similar success. So firstly, why the USA? We know for starters, it's got huge audiences. It doesn't matter how sort of weird or niche your products may be, chances are the population is big enough that there's going to be a sizable audience there for you to go after. Again, we'd really recommend looking at how the interests break down for the country as a whole, but also by state. Secondly, it's English speaking. There are differences between our language here and the language over there, which I'll go into a little bit more detail later. But ultimately, you're not going to have to have a translator sort of sifting through all your copy and getting that translated for you. Similar cultural fit. A lot of the stuff we understand, it's going to sort of apply there. Again, not having to do as much research as you would perhaps moving into another region. It's got a very high disposable income, and we tend to see much larger average order values than we do in other regions. Looking at data across all of our clients that run ads both in the UK and US, the US tends to have around a 25% higher average order value than the UK, and that's with the same product offering. So despite the same things being on sale, Americans are just inclined to spend a little bit more money, maybe adding more purchases to their basket and just generally spending more money, which is great for return on ad spend. And then finally, the fact weather is so varied from state to state means that there's opportunities to sell all year round. And it's probably one of the few countries in the world where you can sell both skiing gear and swimming trunks in the same month, depending on which state you're in. So there is a temptation to look at the US as a single market. And I think coming from the UK, we do forget how small we are in relation to somewhere like North America. And we forget how varied things are from state to state. There are obviously differences in regions in the UK, and somebody in London isn't going to act necessarily the same way as somebody from Newcastle, for example, but the difference isn't nearly as drastic as it is in America. So when you're getting started there, it's very tempting and easy to roll out a uniformed approach across the country and start by targeting every state. And this is something that we were guilty of doing as well to begin with, but we soon learned that there's different opportunities in each state, and it almost makes sense to treat each state like a separate region. But once you start advertising there, the data should start to kind of pull out some of these learnings for you. So on the next slides, we have 4 states highlighted, which is where we were seeing the bulk of our sales coming from initially. That's California, Texas, Florida, and New York. Probably not that surprising. They're all very large states with the biggest populations. 3 of them have lots of coastline, which is obviously good for a brand selling beach towels and swimming trunks and other related items. And to begin with, Facebook's algorithm was pretty good at pushing the majority of the budget to each of these regions. There was still some money being spent in all the middle states where we were seeing significantly lower return on ad spend. So we kind of knew we weren't being as efficient as we could be, but it wasn't until kind of August, September and the end of summer, our peak season, when we really started to see sales drop off. And we kind of realized that we really needed to drill down into the interest within these states and start to understand what makes people purchase in each state and what's the messaging that's going to resonate best with them. So we had this idea that we wanted to roll out of different creative in each different region. So really kind of taking a look at the interests as a country as a whole. So kind of thinking big and looking at the opportunities there are for us, but then acting local. So on the next slides are a few different creative examples that we began to introduce. So these were just the opening frames that we launched with, and we did sort of expand on these and make longer videos playing on the different interests. But essentially, we kind of worked out that people in California and Florida were more likely to buy these beach towels because of interests like surfing, swimming, everything beach related. Whereas in New York, they were purchasing a much larger volumes of the like cooling towels, which were designed for gym use. So you can see here, we kind of call out New York gym goers in the creative. And when we launched these ads, almost immediately, we saw a much higher click-through rate on anything that called out the state. So people were seeing these ads, they were obviously interested that it was localized to somewhere near them. And it wasn't just this kind of general ad that most ads typically are. It's a little bit more personal, and people responded to that really well. But alongside this kind of hyper localized creative, we also looked at tone of voice. And that's something we've been doing a lot of experimenting in the US over the last year. And our key takeaway is that they tend to respond much better to things like key selling points, discounts, testimonials, free shipping thresholds. So that's not to say these things don't work in the UK. And I'm sure anybody listening who's involved with performance marketing and direct response knows that these levers are the things that drive short-term sales. But we found, whereas in the UK, we can be a bit more descriptive and kind of bring in more storytelling elements. It was these things that had like significantly better performance in America. So whilst this localized approach was starting to get pretty good results for us, we were kind of aware of having a bit of a fractured approach, and we did want something to kind of tie the brand together. Don't want a completely different tone of voice in each market. So we produced a brand building video, which sort of plays a little bit on the kind of British heritage of the brand and adding in some humor. And we had this as a more kind of longer term brand building piece that we rolled out to every state to make sure that we're not only pushing these localized messages, but that we have some things to kind of tie it all together. So I think James is just going to play it now.
So here's the thing. We set up a beach towel company in the UK. Weird, we know, but it worked. Still, there are only so many beach towels you can sell in the country when it rains all the time. And so now we're here, in the land of opportunity. We're not here for the sad, rain-soaked people. We're here for the sun seekers, the jet skiers, the wave riders, and the mountain climbers. These guys can have one. So can she? No, not him. She can have one, and him. Yeah, definitely not this guy. This legend already has one. Get ready for the joy of your life. We are Doc and Bear.
So as you can see, it's a slightly longer form video, trying to build in elements of brand building rather than just sort of direct product focused marketing, which tends to drive conversions. But ultimately, the kind of combination of these tactics we saw worked really well for us over the last 18 months. And here we've got a couple of graphs that kind of show that. So on the left, we have revenue, which has been sort of gradually increasing at a steady rate over the last couple of years. Whilst at the same time, we've seen a falling cost per purchase. Typically, there's a trade-off between efficiency and scale. So as you spend more money and drive more revenue, you tend to become less efficient, and it costs more to acquire customers as you have to cast the net a little bit further. But we've sort of bucked that trend. and we think that this kind of thinking big but acting local strategy has been a really key point for us. And as I said earlier, doesn't just have to apply to the US. And when you're considering expanding into a new market, we'd kind of recommend doing this research and approaching it in the same way. Great. And then finally, James is just going to summarize some of the things that we've talked about.
Great, yeah. So we've taken you through today the fact that one size doesn't fit all. It's really tempting to just kind of add those countries into when you're targeting new UK campaigns, but we would say that's definitely a trap you don't want to fall into. Really think about the nuances of the different countries and why you're going into them to create a bespoke plan for scaling in a new region. I think we've seen how important it is to treat different countries differently to generate the best results. Picking a country is also super important. There may be temptations to kind of go after the largest opportunities like the USA, but if you can be smart about where you can find the demand for your products, you can often find other opportunities other people aren't necessarily thinking about, which gives a really great opportunity for you to kind of be first to market in an area rather than kind of trying to take down the number one player in a particular region. Choosing your moment. On top of this, it's really great to try and launch at times when people are more likely to buy, but if you can make kind of tweaks to your UK marketing calendar to add in these international moments, you're going to have more holiday events or e-commerce events that will allow for increased demand, therefore hopefully increased sales and revenue. And then finally, we took you through a case study on the USA about how we were thinking big, but acting local to create a bespoke state-by-state strategy overlaid with brand awareness advertising to drive revenue in that country whilst reducing CPA. And that's everything we had to take you through today. Hopefully it was useful. I don't know if there have been any questions, but I'm going to hand back over to Steph. A bit of a Q&A. I don't know if we have time. Steph?
Thanks, James and John. Really comprehensive overview of going global on social. We actually don't have time for our Q&A this morning, so that you guys have time to get yourselves ready for your 11 a.m. meetings. But if you do have any questions for us, please do send them across to shout@bornsocial.co.uk and we'll get back to you with our thoughts. Thank you so much for joining this morning. Hopefully you found it useful and enjoyable. When you leave the session, there will be a little survey that comes up. It'd be amazing if you could spend a minute just to let us know your feedback. But yeah, have a lovely Thursday and speak soon.